Welcome to everyone coming in. I'm Quinn Adamowski, Regional Advocacy Manager for Landmarks, Illinois, and we're excited to have you with us today for a wonderful presentation. We are now live and recording. We're going to wait a minute to make sure that everyone has a chance to get in, check their settings before we begin today's program. As people continue coming in, I will go over a few housekeeping items in the interest of time. Closed captions are available for anyone who may need them. If you would like to be able to read the text, just go to the bottom of your screen and click the CC button. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the program, so please post your questions in the chat section and they will be addressed after the presentation. That's it for the housekeeping. Looks like we have a couple more people coming in, so we'll get started here in just 1 minute. All right, good afternoon. If you're just joining us, my name is Quinn Adamowski, Regional Advocacy Manager for Landmarks, Illinois. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation, Preservation Snapshots lecture, The Underground Railroad and Freedom Seeking in the 19th Century, the Law versus Morality. Our guest presenter today is University of Illinois professor Gerald McWorter, who you will hear from in just a few minutes. And a special welcome to those who may be joining us for the first time. Before our presentation, I wanted to share some information about our organization. Landmarks, Illinois is a statewide historic preservation nonprofit founded in 1971 to help people save places that are important to them and their communities. Our advocacy team works on 150 to 200 projects at any given time all across the state. And since our founding in 1971, we have helped save almost 24,000 places. We are glad you joined us today to learn about some of our important ongoing work, and we hope that you visit our website to see all that Landmarks Illinois has done and is doing to help people save places for people. You can also visit our YouTube channel to see other great presentations and projects Landmarks Illinois is involved in. Before starting our program, I would like to thank our dedicated and generous members and supporters. Our impact in communities across the state is a direct result of your contributions to Landmarks Illinois. This includes our generous Preservation Snapshot sponsors, C&H Specialty Craftworks, Jack Corp, and Vinci Hamp Architects. Their support ensures that we can host this lecture series to share preservation stories from across the state. And a special thank you to our annual corporate sponsors. We have several great companies who support our work here at Landmarks, Illinois. If you or your company are interested in supporting our work, we would be happy to speak with you. Again, thank you to our generous sponsors. And thank you to all the members of Landmarks, Illinois who are joining us today. Membership support is essential to our success in advocacy, education, and programs. If you are not currently a member, please join us today at landmarks.org. And just a reminder before we get started, if you need closed captioning, go to the bottom of your screen and click the CC button. We are recording this presentation and it will be uploaded and available on our YouTube channel. Okay, our lecture today is about freedom. Specifically, it's about those who sought freedom during the dark days of our shared history. We are all familiar with the Underground Railroad, its importance in helping freedom seekers, and we are familiar with particular sites. So what about the stories of those who freed themselves on those harrowing paths? The stories of people who freed themselves by breaking their chains and traveling into the unknown are stories that must be told, stories that must be shared, and stories that must be preserved for future generations. On February 2nd and 3rd, I had the privilege to attend the inaugural Freedom Corridor Conference in Jacksonville, Illinois, held at Illinois College. The Freedom Corridor is a network of sites in West and Central Illinois that tell the stories of former slaves who fought and sacrificed to free themselves and their families. The corridor is a result of a vision led by Gerald McWorter, a professor at the University of Illinois and a descendant of free Frank McWorter, who was a freedom seeker that established New Philadelphia in 1836. Sites in the Freedom Corridor include New Philadelphia, Springfield, Jacksonville, Pittsfield, Barry, and Quincy, all in Illinois. It also includes Hannibal, Missouri. We invite you to listen closely as Professor McWorter tells us about the Freedom Corridor, the Underground Railroad, and freedom seeking in the 19th century. Welcome, Professor McWorter. It's great to see you again. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. This talk is about the Underground Railroad and abolitionism, especially in the context of the country at this time. The contradiction between what the law allows and what is consistent with morally justifiable values, legal or illegal, versus the moral values of right and wrong. Now,
I'm so sorry, Professor. I don't think we have a full screen. Maybe you could do full screen. And if not, we can just leave it as is. A square up at the top, maybe.
Square at the top.
In the top right hand, you might see a square that might do, you see like a dash, a square, and an X. Do the square. Pick the square in the top right hand corner. And if not, we can leave it just like this.
Okay, I'm not seeing that square.
Okay, all right. Well, we should be able to see. Hopefully everybody can see. Let us know in the chat if you have any trouble seeing, and please continue.
Okay, sorry about that. Now here in this first slide, we contrast an image of a slave calling out, "Am I not a man and a brother?" and an image of Jesus. Now there are many slavery quotes in the Bible, and not all of them call on the slaves to rise up and resist. Some even say submit. But I find it interesting to quote Moses in the biblical book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 15 and 16. And I quote, "If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them." Here we have the contradiction between slavery as a legal system and a moral mandate to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. This is the framework for this talk. Here's the outline I will follow. The origin of this country is a struggle, the contradiction of being slave or free. Inside this contradiction is the reality that slavery was legal, but being moral meant that one had to break the law and work against slavery. This contradiction can be a way to think about and compare the practice of two men, Abraham Lincoln and Frank McWorter. And finally, how this helps us understand the legacy we live in the 21st century. Now, this slide shows the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Look at the people in this slide. What do you see? 41 of these 56 men own slaves. So we have to sum up the history of this country as being a racist, patriarchal settler colony. Now, okay, I know that sounds like a woke summation, but let me try to break it down and give you some idea of what I'm talking about. First of all, a settler colony is people who seize land from people already living there. While at the same time, of course, including people who were themselves escaping tyranny and exploitation in Europe. The economic foundation of this country begins with slavery. 10 of the first 12 presidents of the US owned slaves. The cost was the enslavement of Africans in North America who suffered for 400 years. The legal end of slavery has only been for 159 years. So we continue to deal with the legacy of this institutionalized barbarism. No, nothing about slavery was good, certainly for Black people, except maybe some slave owners in their way of thinking. But even the slave owners were taught the negative values of greed and assumed privilege by living off the labor of people they didn't have to pay. And of course, women didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Constitutional Amendment was passed and ratified in 1919, 143 years after the Declaration of Independence. And then there was genocide used against the Native Americans. And still today, 13% of their descendants are living on over 300 reservations. But what is good is that the fight for freedom, justice, and equality has been a constant feature reignited by every generation. This applies to women, the elderly, the working class in general, everybody, and of course, African Americans. Now, this painting shows George Washington with the slaves he owned. We have to remember that the first president, George Washington, then one of the richest people in the country, owned slaves. Born into a slave-owning family, marrying a woman who owned slaves, he nevertheless, however, left a will that after his death and his wife's death, those slaves would go free. Now, this slide shows this dialectic as states were formed on one side of the question or the other, slave or free. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you see the original 13 states. 6 were slave, 7 were free. Then, of the next 14 states that are listed here, they were split even, 7 slave, 7 free. This was a divide based on the alternative economic development of the southern states versus the northern states. There were 2 labor systems, slave versus free wage workers. Slaved worked from can't see to can't see, meaning you went to work as a slave before the sun came up and you kept working until the sun went down, from can't see to can't see. While white wage workers were fighting to change the workday to being 8 hours. So on May 19th, 1869, shortly after the Civil War, President Grant issued a national 8-hour law proclamation. So there were 2 systems. The divide between the free states and the slave states created the geographical terrain of the Underground Railroad. Now, this map is where the National Park Service, through its Network to Freedom program, locates sites of the Underground Railroad. This was a secret, illegal process. So this map only suggests the identity of how the freedom seekers moved from slavery to free states. Note how few sites there are in the slave South identified on the Network to Freedom map. The main concentrations on this map are on the East Coast and the Midwest. As the years go by, more research will reveal more and more sites. We need to examine every river as a pathway north, every Black community, and every church, especially those institutions with an abolitionist orientation. The point is that what we know only today only points to the possibility of what we can know with more research. Now, the impulse to get free was nearly universal, certainly for all slaves with a positive self-image and concern for family. This was so intense, this motion toward freedom, that by 1850, Congress passed 5 bills as a compromise to hold the country together. They included California would be a free state and Washington, D.C. would not allow slave trading, but that the territories of New Mexico and Utah would have no restrictions on being slave or free. That was left. But the big compromise was that slave owners got the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act, even named in the interest of the slave owner, that the freedom seekers then were called fugitives. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that freedom seekers could be captured and returned to slavery, even opening the door to grabbing any free Black person for enslavement. Of course, these laws were passed by the political elite, by staunch Christians. Now, here's what Frederick Douglass says about that. Quote, "For all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have ever found them the meanest and basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all others." That's Frederick Douglass. In other words, economic interest dominated morality. Now, here is the interpretation given by the National Park Service, and I quote, "The increasing incidence of escapes cause enactment of a tougher law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which compelled all citizens to participate in the capture and return of freedom seekers, or risk fines and prison sentences. The spectacle of African American re-enslavement on the slightest pretext and the sale of kidnapped free African Americans south into slavery brought home the immoral dilemma to individuals in the North. Some opponents to slavery opted to change laws, while some recognized a higher moral law. Those who were freedom seekers or helped them to escape were part of the Underground Railroad." Now, this American dilemma was resolved in 1865 when Congress passed the 13th Constitutional Amendment and the states ratified it. Now, here in Illinois, we have to recognize the fact and celebrate the fact that a week after Congress passed the 13th Amendment, Illinois was the first state to ratify it, taking a position against slavery. Now, this framework that I've been outlining here is connected to the ideas of this theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr of Union Theological Seminary of the early part of the 20th century. Specifically, his 1932 book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, a study in ethics and politics. Let me quote from that book. "When economic power desires to be left alone, it uses a philosophy of laissez-faire to discourage political restraint upon economic freedom. When it wants to make use of police power of the state to subdue rebellions and discontent in the ranks of its helots, it justifies the use of political coercion and the resulting suppression of liberties by insisting that peace is more precious than freedom, and that its only desire is social peace." In other words, he wrote this during the Depression and the struggle around the contradictions of capitalism, around the suffering of the working people and what they experienced. And it seems to me that this moral man, that is our individual morality versus the structures of society, is an important framework to understand the whole contradictions that existed during slavery, and it might help us understand contradictions that exist today. In other words, what Reinhold is saying is that to be moral means one had to rebel against unjust laws. Now, how does this help us to understand Abraham Lincoln? Now, Abe had a problem. On the one hand, he was a politician and had to uphold the law, and slavery was legal. On the other hand, his moral position, his personal moral position, was for freedom and not slavery. Let's quote this slide. And this is Abe Lincoln talking now. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. Right? This Civil War is going on. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, that is, as a politician, the law. And I intend no modifications of my often expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. That was in 1862. The next year, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. There was slavery in Union states, and there was slavery in Confederate states. Lincoln didn't free the slaves where he could in Union states. He announced the slaves were free only in Confederate states, where he couldn't free them. The intention was to disrupt the Confederacy and encourage Black resistance. Now, before that, Lincoln had supported the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to keep the country from splitting apart. In other words, it was a compromise, a deal struck with slave owners. But the system broke down anyway, and the Civil War took place. Now, he remained unresolved in this contradiction, even while being clear on his personal moral conviction when he said in his 1865 inauguration address, a month before the end of the Civil War, he was once again trying to honor both people who advocated slavery and those for freedom. Now, this is what he said in his inaugural address. Both read the same Bible, free slave owners. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been fully answered. End of quote. In other words, he did what was necessary in his idea to defeat the Confederacy, and for that he is honored. But we must remember that his position was opposed to the great abolitionists of the day and the main motion by Black people to free themselves. What they wanted was illegal. Now, for a Black comparison to Lincoln, we can turn to Frank and Lucy McWorter, both born into slavery, but they got free through their own determined action in the same state, Kentucky, out of which Lincoln came. They are my great-great-grandparents, Frank and Lucy. They were the first African Americans to plot and legally register a town in the US in 1836 in Pike County, Illinois. And in 2022, Congress made New Philadelphia a National Historic Site, part of the National Park System. Frank and Lucy. Now, their town, New Philadelphia, was an abolitionist village in west central Illinois, 20 miles from the Mississippi River and the slave state of Missouri. It became a model for the freedom struggle. Now, there are two new initiatives that connect with New Philadelphia. First, the area connecting Springfield, Illinois and Hannibal, Missouri, that Quinn pointed out, Springfield, Jacksonville, Pittsfield, Berry, Quincy, and then Hannibal, Missouri. Via Highway 72 connecting those places is being called, we're calling it a Freedom Corridor. This is based on the Underground Railroad and abolitionism in general, and the memory institutions, the museums and libraries, historical societies that have secured community memory. The formal launch of this project was last month at a conference at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. Now, the second initiative has been created by the Illinois State Legislature, establishing a task force to design a permanent commission on freedom, the Underground Railroad, and abolitionism. This will mobilize people and organizations in all parts of the state and assist memory institution bringing this history back into focus. In other words, so we don't forget, and therefore we don't reconnect with whatever that was about. This will mobilize people and organizations. I'm co-chair of one of the subcommittees of this task force and can get anybody interested in the process on the mailing list. The meetings are open to the public, so if you're interested, get in touch. Same is true with the Freedom Corridor. Please get in touch if you're interested at all. So New Philadelphia, you can see in this map, was an ambitious town because what Frank and Lucy did after freeing themselves, purchasing themselves out of slavery and purchasing 16 family members out of slavery, they founded this town and then used selling the lots in this town to get money to do those purchases of family out of slavery in Kentucky. And you can see from the map on the right in this slide, the towns connected close to New Philadelphia. Now, to sum up its role in the freedom struggle, I wrote this poem about New Philadelphia. 7 Ways to Freedom. They ran, they helped others run, they bought, they fought, a town, a law, and they lived free. Now, those are descriptions of what happened in New Philadelphia, but if you take it in a bigger sense, it's a picture of the freedom narrative that covers the entire country. They ran. These are the freedom seekers, the real heroes and sheroes of the Underground Railroad, the people who fought in many ways to get free. Second, they helped others. This is the Underground Railroad, the network of people that helped the freedom seekers. They bought themselves out of slavery. They paid. They fought. They joined the Civil War. They became part of the Union Army. A town, they set up and lived in communities. A law, they got legislation passed. Frank got a law passed in 1837, that established his right to sue and be sued, to be able to take to court people. Now, this was an exception because the Black codes of Illinois did not allow that in general for Black people. And they lived free in an abolitionist village. But of course, this was not the only way that these 7 ways that Black people were getting free. Let me mention these other 4 that are listed here on this slide. First of all, there are slave revolts. a different kind of armed struggle. There were times when slave owners, as I mentioned about George Washington, established freedom process for slave people that they owned. There were conventions, National Negro Convention movement before the Civil War and after, was when free Black people gathered together to discuss how to get free and what to do. And in Illinois, there were national meetings, there were state meetings. In Illinois, the 3 state meetings were held in Alton, Galesburg, and Chicago. And then, of course, there were publications. Not only did we have the great example of personal autobiographies, the great slave narratives where people wrote their stories down, but we also had newspapers and journals that were published by Black people as part of the abolitionist movement. So we had the 7 ways to freedom and then these other additional ways. Now, as far as the Underground Railroad goes, it's part of this history and the national story, and certainly the Illinois experience. And Larry McElham, an activist in Illinois, particularly in the Underground Railroad story linking Chicago to Detroit, all those places in the northern part of the state. He's right when he says the stories of Illinois need to be included in the national story of the Underground Railroad, and currently they are not. In other words, there is a need, and that's why the Illinois State Legislature is establishing this task force so that we can better understand the fact that not only was Illinois part of the oppression history of Black people, it was also part of the great narrative of freedom. But morally, we have to always determine the difference between right and wrong, between good and bad, between what the society is like versus what is wrong with it. Now, Martin Luther King said it for all of us, and I quote, "I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws." So think about it. People who were in slavery, when they went on the Underground Railroad, they were stealing themselves from the slave owners, and the law regarded that as an illegal act. So on every river and on every border state, there was this constant struggle for people to get free, and it was all illegal. And people who helped them, illegal. But it was morally just. We have to think about that not only in relationship to the time of slavery, we have to think about it in relationship to right now. Our country today is sick with racism, and every institution is or should be on trial for institutional racism. In other words, the history of discrimination against Black people, be it the government, the private sector, and community institutions in general. And people still march with their banner of the discredited flag of the Confederacy. People who armed struggle attack the state. And so the Confederate flag really represents that thrust of immorality in the country. And we face the challenge laid down by Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet. And I quote, "Let America be America again, the land it never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where everyone is free." what we're talking about here, as what we were talking about then, gets down to something very simple: the golden rule. It's a basic guideline for morality. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what this slide shows is that every major religion, and these are just three, and it includes all the rest of the religions of the world, this moral principle, the golden rule, the basis on which we can establish love and harmony and friendship and kindness and peace. And now is the time to think about and implementing the golden rule. Now, freedom-seeking people can unite. Unity is more important than any difference in the fight for freedom, justice, and equality. Look at this slide. Here's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, often referred to as irreconcilable poles in a movement for freedom. And yet, both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King understood that they were part of the same struggle. The strategy for freedom is something that they shared. There were differences, but the possibility of becoming a moral and just society, the possibility that existed in the 19th century of helping people leave the South in slavery and get to the North in freedom, was embraced. There was an abolitionist movement that swept the entire country. This is a movement we just don't know enough about. We don't know enough about it in the state of Illinois because it happened and the great system of slavery was defeated. And I think if we really understand that history, it's going to be possible for us to be on the road to freedom and make another major step forward, and certainly avoid being drugged back into the past that's discredited and immoral. Thank you very much. That's it.
Professor, thank you very much for your presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Bonnie McDonald. I'm the president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois, and I'm going to ask, would you, Professor McWorter, would you stop sharing your screen, and we can commence with our question and answer at this point. All right, there we go. I think we've got that taken down at this point. So again, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to have our question and answer, which you're welcome to put into the chat, and we will manage it that way. So Professor, our first question, can you tell us more about Free Frank and Free Lucy, and how were they commemorated in New Philadelphia?
Yes, thank you for the question. Frank McWorter was enslaved in Kentucky and was able to hire out himself, and interestingly enough, was able to mine saltpeter. And saltpeter is an ingredient in gunpowder. And he was able to make money because of the need for gunpowder in the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. And so he was able then to buy Lucy from slavery because she was pregnant. They had a relationship and they had children. And the next child they wanted to be born free. And so Lucy was the first person purchased out of slavery. And then, of course, the next person was Frank himself. They ended up being able to, sight unseen, sell their interest in the saltpeter operation and other financial resources they had, and buy land in Illinois. And this was very important. They hadn't seen the land. Someone had seen it and written back and said, It was a good place because it's those who know Illinois know it's flat. But when you get to Pike County, in between the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, it's hilly. And so there's water and the land was good. And so they were the first settlers in Hadley Township of Pike County. And a lot of times, a lot of people don't know that Pike County at that time was one of the largest counties in the state because it extended all the way to the northern border of the state. So anyway, so Frank and Lucy established this and had very interesting experiences because of several of their offspring. Let me just mention Solomon, who was one of Frank's sons, who he had traveled back to Kentucky to purchase and bring back to New Philadelphia. Well, as it turns out, Solomon was the first African-American to get a U.S. patent in the state of Illinois and one of the top 10 in the whole country. And what was interesting is that his invention that he got a patent for was to process sorghum into a sweetener. It was a way of processing sorghum. And that's important because the abolitionist movement did not want to use what they called blood-stained sugar from the sugar cane that came from the South. So this was part of the abolitionist movement to process sorghum into a sweetener. So that's what was going on in New Philadelphia. Now, the New Philadelphia story was maintained in family histories, in oral histories, not only in our family, in other families as well. And so I grew up with that story, and it was our family story. Now it's our nation's story as part of the national park system. And the one way to deal with the significance of Frank McWorter is you've got Springfield and Abraham Lincoln on the east, and then Highway 72 takes you to Hannibal, and you've got Mark Twain in Hannibal. And those are two really giant figures that are often discussed when it comes to the anti-slavery motion of that historical period. Well, right in the middle of that is Frank McWorter. So now we have the opportunity to discuss African-American agency as part of the self-determination impulse for people to free themselves. And so that's really the story of the Underground Railroad, is to acknowledge the fact that freedom seekers, people who risk their lives to escape slavery, are the real heroes, and as I said, and sheroes of the Underground Railroad. And which is not to take anything away from allies and people who helped them, but I mean, the nameless ones, they're the ones that we have to really honor and find out more about.
Yes, I think we all appreciate, especially the women in the audience or who identify as women, that you have named Free Lucy as well in this today, because as we know, many of the women are overlooked in this process. Of course, we celebrate, we amplify the story of Harriet Tubman, but there are hundreds of other women who were resisting, who were seeking freedom, who were assisting amongst those 7 ways to freedom that you talked about and more. So thank you for also bringing forward Lucy's story. And, the two of them lived a long life, it looked like. Could you take a moment, Professor, to just tell us a little more about their life in New Philadelphia, and then what happened to New Philadelphia? Because if you look for it on a map, you unfortunately are not going to find their home. You're not going to find the town itself. If you walk, try to find the places, the buildings. What happened to it?
Yeah, the town was established in the 1830s. And it lasted really until the almost 1880 through the 70s. And like a lot of towns that were established, the economic issues were critical. And so the people began to leave New Philadelphia because of the search for jobs. And this, of course, my family didn't leave entirely until the 1960s, and there are two stories that so far research has revealed. One is a railroad was coming through, and the railroad diverted, instead of coming through New Philadelphia, diverted to the north. And so there's that issue that had the railroad come through, there would have been a different economic possibility. But also, one of the interesting aspects of the story is the relationship between New Philadelphia, the town of Barry, which is just a few miles away, the town of Quincy, which is several miles away right on the Mississippi River. There was a lot of commerce between those cities. And so while the town existed, and what was interesting is that our oral history has that there were, in New Philadelphia, the story was if freedom seeker got to New Philadelphia, they could get a pair of shoes and a horse, and those McWorter boys would help you get further north. And that's oral history. But then the archaeologists came, and we discovered that, in fact, there were two cobblers in New Philadelphia. So there's now historical evidence that backs up the oral history. So I want to just say to anybody listening, and for the whole process of recovering this history, oral history is important. Oral history guides us to direct us to do further research. And as any good academic would recommend, you need more than one source for any given historical finding. But you often have to begin with oral history. And so one of the great regrets that I have now as a very senior member of my family is, as a younger person, I didn't debrief the older members of the family as much as I should have, because now, for example, we have photographs, and people didn't write on the back of the photographs the names of these people or the dates. And so we know that they're either friends or family, but so that we don't exactly know what Frank looked like. We do know what Lucy looked like at a older age. One of my relatives, Shirley McWorter Moss, whose career was as an engineer, she ended up becoming a sculptress. And she studied photographs of people in the family and, felt people's heads, etc. And she did a bust of Frank. The first time I met her, she came up to me and started feeling on my head, to validate how she envisioned Frank. But on Frank and Lucy's relationship, people talk about Frank, but I wonder maybe it was Lucy who was running the show. In other words, we don't see, the thing is, we have to have a historical imagination and imagine possibilities. So, for example, the Shipman family, who lived near and in New Philadelphia, the Shipman matriarch, wrote a lot of letters. And so these letters are now in their family archive in Hawaii. And Kate and I went to Hawaii, and we actually were able to examine these letters and take photographs of these letters. And she discusses Lucy. She discusses, and she even talks about our cousin Solomon. Now, these are, in other words, this was the closeness of people who were living. And we have a abolitionist pamphlet that looks like her handwriting, on it. And it's in the McWorter archive. She says, please read and return. Well, it wasn't returned, but, right. So there is that connection. In other words, women, as in we all know, are often the infrastructure that holds things together. And we do have this set of letters that really help us to understand that.
Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that, because we often refer to women as the keepers of culture in many ways, the keepers of tradition. And Lucy had a long time to do that, since she lived to 99, it looks like, which is incredible. And if all of us could just have our family archives in Hawaii, I bet we would appreciate that too, right, everyone? So Professor, we do have a question from a person who you probably know well, Judy Tai in Jacksonville, who is part of the Freedom Corridor effort. And Judy is asking, do you have information about, Ben Henderson from Jacksonville? So who is Ben Henderson?
Well, I would want to refer to Art Wilson, who is the key person in the two institutions in Jacksonville. One of the important possibilities really is to alert everybody that we're having a webinar series for the Freedom Corridor that will start in April. And Art Wilson will be one of the speakers who will go into great detail on Jacksonville. And so I want everybody to stay tuned for that.
Okay. Well, perhaps that is something that Layla Wills, our programs manager, could put into the chat for everyone, how to find more information about the webinar series from the Freedom Corridor, as well as I know that after this, we're going to have many people asking how to get a hold of you, how to become more active in the Freedom Corridor as a task force. So thank you. You've invited that. We have maybe 5 or 7 more minutes as people are sending us questions. You know, I certainly would like to ask a question of you, since you work with so many young people as a professor. You have access to the next generation of freedom fighters in many ways. And I love how you talked about the fact that each generation has its own fight for freedom. So I wonder what you think their fight for freedom is going to be.
Well, I think it as we said in the Freedom Corridor Conference, the past and the future are linked. So I think one of the things that every generation has to do is to understand, the history out of which it comes. And that's so very important, not only in terms of our families, because one of the problems, of course, is you get interested in genealogy when you have gray hair. And, it's too late. If you're interested earlier, and you can actually talk to some people and get some information, but you wait and then they're gone. So that's the first thing I would say is, but it's also the history of your community. Every community has people that often don't get remembered. The struggles of a PTA, the struggles of the library, the struggles of, on every battlefront. So that's one thing, history. But another thing I think is this whole question of really, it's a question of the golden rule in relationship to the diversity of the human species. This is a country of immigrants, and now we have this great hostility toward immigrants. So the one of the interesting things about college, and to some extent is true in high school, but more in college, because students have an opportunity to choose courses that they would take. And here's an opportunity really to explore the world. And one of the things, I had a high school teacher who said to me once, you can go anywhere in the world through reading. And I mean, I was like, whoa, that really struck me, I said, wow, and so the embracing of the cultural diversity of the world, of knowing other people, and a lot of times people think that they're eating Mexican food when they go to one of the chains, and I recommend try to find out where the Mexicans are eating. Go eat there. Find where the Chinese eating. Go eat there. In other words, find out the value of the diversity of our species. And in the United States, it's possible to do that almost anywhere. But I would also say that the third thing I would say is that there are battlefronts that occur. And right now, for example, the Me Too movement of women, the struggle around Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
You have to wonder why such a slogan would be controversial. But that tells you something about what's going on. And I think that there are struggles regarding the reemergence of a trade union movement.
Mm.
You know, it's something when back in the time of the Civil War, what workers were fighting over was a livable wage and reducing the hours of work. As I said, it was 12 hours and 10 hours and fighting for an 8-hour day. Those are the same struggles that people are fighting for today. A livable wage. It is possible to work a full-time job and still having to go to a food bank. You know, and so this idea really, that what that represents is seeing the world, seeing the country, not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. In other words, what constitutes quality of life for the average person? And I think a lot of times we get so caught up in our own lives, those of us who are not going to food banks, that we don't think about what it's like to be in a society where people have to struggle over whether they have enough to eat. And this is a country with, I mean, I'm at the University of Illinois. University of Illinois is a land grant institution. Land grant institutions were established so that higher education could impact agriculture and industry. And land was given to every state, and so every state has a land grant institution. And so that we have a powerful agriculture that was really designed to be that way. And yet there are people who don't eat enough in this country. So those are, and see, those are moral questions. Those aren't just political questions of interest versus interest. They're moral questions. And so we really have to keep morality as a primary rationale or basis for how we behave in the world, and not simply what serves us, you know, in kind of a zero-sum game, you know, of me versus you, you know, that doesn't seem to be the way the world can survive the way we want it to. So anyway, those are the kind of ideas that now I recently in the News Gazette of Urbana, they had a page which had 10 people who were distinguished alumni, et cetera, talking about their experience at the University of Illinois. And one young person who was a young alumni of the year of the College of Arts and Sciences said what impacted him the most was the course he took from me. And one of the interesting things in the article that he wrote is he was so excited he went home and talked to his mother about it. And she said, well, who is he? And he gave my name, and she almost fell off the chair. She said, I took his course in the 1970s, and it had the same impact on me. So anyway.
The power of a great teacher.
Well, I'm hoping to live long enough to get to his children, make 3 generations.
We certainly hope so. And I think this is an opportunity for us to thank you and every teacher out there who is able to connect history to what we are enduring today as a people, as a society, to make it relevant, to make history relevant to us. And you know, we are running out of time. You see Quinn here to close us out. But I want to encourage people, you have the Sankofa bird in your slide of the 7 ways that people sought freedom and more. So go and look up the principles of Sankofa and the griots, storytellers who shared history, and just learn more about how we can enliven history. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to send any additional questions you have, and we will get them to Professor McWorter. And it's been a delight. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, for facilitating the Q&A, and thank you for your presentation and conversation, Professor. That really was fantastic. And we look forward to working with you and the others focused on preserving the important history of freedom seekers and to keep telling these stories. And thank you to all of you who tuned in today for your questions and comments. We hope that you enjoyed today's Preservation Snapshots lecture. And a special thank you to our programs manager, Layla Wills, for putting this together. If you do have ideas about potential lectures, please feel free to reach out to Layla. A few important announcements to share with you before we depart. Landmarks Illinois held our 2024 Preservation Forward event on February 29th at the old post office in Chicago. We had approximately 730 guests who joined us in honoring our 2024 Landmarks Illinois influencers, listed there on the screen. The annual fundraiser raised approximately $600,000 for Landmarks Illinois' mission-driven work, helping people save places. So thank you to all of our supporters and donors who helped make the event a success. This year, the Edith Farnsworth House is marking its 20th anniversary of being open to the public. The house was designed for Chicago physician Edith Farnsworth and is on the banks of the Fox River near Plano in Kendall County. Joanne Tunovich, a Landmarks Illinois former chairman, was part of the campaign to save the historic home, and he will join us on Thursday, April 4th for a special presentation, so please be sure to sign up. And next, every year since 1995, Landmarks Illinois has asked for submissions throughout the state to nominate endangered historic properties, just like the Farnsworth House, for our annual list. Stay tuned for the Most Endangered Historic Places announcement and program scheduled for May 7th. And it's almost time to submit your nominations for the Landmarks Illinois Richard H. Driehaus Awards. A generous grant from the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation enables Landmarks Illinois to present awards to individuals, organizations, projects, and programs whose work demonstrates a commitment to historic preservation. Last year's event was awesome, so please stay tuned for the announcement for that. And so the question, how can you possibly stay up to date on all the great programs and events? I would ask you to join our email list and you'll receive those updates so you don't miss out. If you would like to support Landmarks Illinois, we are always looking for members and donors to help us continue helping people save places. If you'd like to sponsor the Snapshots lecture series or some of our other initiatives, we have opportunities, so please get in touch with us. Our staff's information is on the landmarks.org website. We're happy to talk to you about these opportunities. Thank you, Professor McWorter, Layla, and Bonnie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. See you again soon. Take care and have a good day.